Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bible Quest. This is the Tuesday edition. We're glad you're able to join us today. And if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, be sure to fill out the comment section there with any comments that you have or questions you have. Or you can also go to BibleQuest.org. That's BibleQuest.org. Actually, sometimes people put in BibleQuest.tv, which it used to be. Go to either one, it works. And you can find the contact us form there. And let us know what's on your mind. If you want special things you'd like us to be talking about during the Bible Quest program, we'd love to hear from you. And so with that said, I first want to bring in Joshua. I start with the young ones first there, Scott. How you doing?
Doing well, thank God. How are you?
Good to see you again. Scott, how you been? In fact, you're younger than me, so I wasn't trying to make you sound older. But unmute your mic and say hi. You gotta unmute your mic. Okay, now there you go.
It's senility, it's dementia.
What's that?
It's senility, it's dementia. That's why I can't remember.
Okay. Good to see you, Scott. How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Okay. And today we actually have a special guest visitor with us, joining us on the panelists, Jonathan Reeder from Alabama, Athens. Is that how you say it, Jonathan? Athens?
That's it.
It's not Athens, it's Athens. Because I've heard some Northerners might say it that way. We're really glad you're able to join us today. In fact, Scott was telling me that you're going to be talking about a particular topic. What is it we're talking about today?
Thanks, Drew, and looking forward to the conversation with you guys. I'd like to talk today about the problem of evil, and more specifically, what you might say would be problems with the problem of evil, and what are sometimes inadequate or unsatisfying responses that Christians often give to that. And so from my perspective, what I would like to hear from you guys and would just like to talk about as well is basically, how can I be better equipped to have the conversation about evil and suffering, not so much with a view toward the Christians who are suffering and in pain, not so much with a view of comfort for them, although we, obviously could take the conversation in that direction, but more with a view of the skeptic or the Christian who is really bothered by what the skeptic would try to use to challenge and undermine our faith. So I don't know if it would be helpful, but yeah, go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably the one thing I hear most, not recently, but over the years, over time, is why people have a hard time accepting a loving God. If he's so loving and so powerful, how could he allow this horrible thing to happen? Sometimes they'll take it personally, or they'll see other people suffering. So I'm glad you're bringing this up, because it's a hard thing to answer, obviously, but there is an answer.
Also, let's distinguish between suffering and evil. Now, there's some connections between suffering and evil. But one of the interesting things is that two common beliefs today are that there can't be a good God because there's so much either suffering or evil, or suffering and evil in the world. But secondarily, there's also the agnostic and atheist point of view that there's really no absolutes and nothing's inherently evil. So how do you dismiss God because of all the evil and say that there's not really any evil? So I'll throw this out. No, I'll wait and hold on this for a bit more. I want to see where Jonathan's going to take us with this. But at some point, I want to throw out a comment about that idea that of everything's relative and there is no absolute evil at some point. Jonathan? Well, get us going in the direction here.
Well, sure. I think that's a great place to actually kind of get kicked off. And, I guess we're assuming that most people are at least basically familiar with that argument from the problem of evil. Like Drew said, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, he sees evil, he can do something about it. And if he's loving, he should want to do something about it. But evil exists, therefore either one or multiple of those things aren't true about God. So the thing that really, just on the surface, it strikes me, and maybe this is helpful for people to think more about and to discuss, and that is the problem of evil is not just a problem for Christians, like you allude to, Scott. It's a problem for any kind of world religion whatsoever. I mean, you could include Hinduism. You could look back to any of the ancient pagan religions. I mean, any worldview, you've got a problem with evil. And to that very point, the atheist or the agnostic has a major problem with evil as well. You know, if it is the case that there's only the material world and we're all just bags of chemical reactions and atoms just colliding and floating through this physical world, how is it that we have notions of good and evil? And so that's something where I think the atheist, you know, also has a big problem with evil. What do you mean by evil? What is it? How do you define it?
Who determines it? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, don't mind me. We just interrupt each other as we go through this. Just continue going. Ignore me.
Yeah. Go on.
Let me throw out here what I was going to say. So I do a thing sometimes on the street with people. It's 1 minute, 4 questions. You know, if you've got 1 minute, I've got 4 questions, and I hand them a card. They can see who I am, what I'm standing for, etc. And if they agree to, then I turn the sheet toward them on a clipboard, and there's their page, and it's got a category of questions. They're going to get 4 questions, but I don't know which questions they're going to get until they answer the first one. So the first one was, you know, would you identify with either being an atheist, an agnostic, you believe in God, or something else? If they go believe in God, then we start differentiating and on down that way. But with an agnostic, their third question is always, are there things that are absolutely wrong or absolutely right, or is right and wrong merely cultural and subjective? And of course, what does almost every agnostic say?
It's subjective.
Yeah, it's relative and cultural. So then question number 4 is, what if a given culture exterminates the elderly, you know, they're pedophiles, and another thing or two? Is their culture right because it's their culture, or is their culture wrong because right and wrong exist above their culture? And sometimes university students will, I suspect dishonestly, try to be consistent, and they say, then it's right. Well, but most of them stop. And like one guy, at Drexel University had a button, I'm a scientist. He says, oh, cultural relative. And when I asked that, he said, that would be wrong. and one lady goes, that would be wrong, but I don't know why.
Yeah, why?
A good point for us to now pivot back to this question. Jonathan?
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think about when, you know, we typically try to address that, you know, whether it's the intellectual coworker that points out human tragedy all over the globe, or matters of genocide from the past, and they try to pin you down, or maybe it's someone in the church that has suffered great tragedy. We try to calm them sometimes, which actually the comfort that we try to give are different forms of addressing the problem of evil. So I don't know if, Josh, we could, you know, loop you into this. If you have, you know, something to say on that, maybe in the past, what have you, you know, maybe seen or heard that might be the typical responses, but things that might leave you a little bit unsettled or unsatisfied about how that might be approached? Or of course, if you either the other.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think when we start talking about the problem of evil, my mind just goes to Job. And I think about Job's friends and how they saw evil as something that was connected with sin, which was connected to, you know, God's always going to be punishing people when they sin, and how that was really what happened to Job, at least in their opinion. And so every bad thing that happened to Job was because of something wrong that Job had done, which is not at all accurate to the situation with Job. But I think a lot of people see suffering as directly a result of someone's own sin.
Which also then could be a reason why they don't want to admit their own sin. Therefore, there's nothing wrong with I've done, and therefore no God. That's a progress that one can make.
And oftentimes people will say, you don't see it now, but God has a plan in this for you. And that's another response people will say. might be, or in a broad sense, but it's not.
Do you think that's helpful, Scott?
No, I think it's often unhelpful.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing that troubles me about some that response, for example, you've got that whole category of responses of it's either some spiritual good, God is strengthening you, or God is testing you, or like you said, God's got some kind of great plan that He has in mind. There comes a point where I think there are clearly scriptures that affirm some of these points, but we also don't have the key that God has given us to match up every life experience for which of these spiritual goods might be occurring.
Right.
And I think there's also too, there is just sometimes what I think scripture would acknowledge as there's sometimes indiscriminate, just pure evil that occurs in this world. Where, like you're saying, Josh, kind of from that standpoint and setting of Job, where He's not letting go of His creation, but there's a license that's sometimes given to creation that's corrupted, that starts to eat itself. And it's one where whether someone's going through some kind of great tragedy in life, or they're seeing their own health physically or mentally torn away from them, or whatever the case may be, some of those replies, I think, not only are sometimes not comforting, but also too, it doesn't address ultimately the question that the skeptic is concerned about. And that is, why would God choose that way of achieving spiritual goods? Couldn't He, a good, loving God, have done it another way? Could He not have created a process by which we could achieve spiritual maturity without us having to hurt and see sin in this world? So those would be, to me, I think it's a biblical response, but I think there's discretion on when we use it, when we discuss that, and also just realizing that the skeptic will not be satisfied with that kind of answer.
Not at all. Not at all.
Well, and if you guys want to take this down maybe another route in terms of just inadequacies that we sometimes see in responses to the problem of evil. What about this business of free will? Because often the response that we would give is, well, of course there's sin and there's evil in this world because God has given us free will. We're the free moral agents. And so for a universe to exist where there is any notion of good or light, there has to be evil, there has to be darkness. And so in order to set forth that clarity, God gave us free will so that we can choose, and that based upon the consequences of those choices, evil can come into the world. I'm sure you guys have heard that kind of that answer before, that response. I will share just quickly an experience that I had once. This was years ago when I was a freshman undergrad at UA Huntsville. And the history professor brought up, the problem of evil and said, what are responses to it that you would have? So I raised my hand and I said, oh, we have free will. And he said, that's your Sunday school answer. You haven't thought about it a lot. And that was it. And he moved on. And so that was kind of an awakening for me of, okay, while that is clearly a biblical concept from Genesis chapter 2 on, that we have free will, that's not doing it. It's not solving it for the skeptic. What do you guys, what have you had experiences where that has worked or not worked in conversations with people? Or do you see maybe shortcomings to that as a response?
I usually haven't gone there, but there are people that claim we don't have free will. So there's atheists that believe that because you're this chemical product that is evolved and mutations have brought us to here and eliminated the competition, and it's pretty much in your DNA, what you're going to be, and you don't really. It's kind of an evolutionary determinism instead of a Calvinism, but it ends up being rather similar. I think I'll just throw this out. I think it's helpful to know that we can know a reality without always knowing the why. So in the book of Job, it's a pretty long book, Job is never told the circumstances that we're told at the beginning. He's told what he needs to know, but he's never told the rest. And so I think probably one thing I would, Josh, you and I were talking this morning about starting at a foundation.
Yeah.
Starting at something that can be agreed on. Can we agree evil exists? Evil does exist, and I might not know why. Not know why. Somebody else might not know why. All the ins and outs does exist, and then does good also exist? And and I do believe we have free will, but that's probably not going to suffice it to a critic to just simply say that we have free will.
And I'm interested where you're going with this, Jonathan, because I did use that in the past myself. Not recently, but I've said, yeah, well, if an evil person, a sinful person, gets drunk and gets into a car accident and harms the child. I was involved in such a thing as a child years ago. Well, it's not the child's fault. It's not God's fault. It's that individual making that choice. Well, that made sense.
Yeah.
But where are you going with this? I'm intrigued with where you're going with this.
I think, again, for someone that isn't a non-believer, the question would be okay, well, where's the free will then for that child? Why is that kind of evil coming upon them? Why would God allow that? He could see a world in which the drunk harms himself, and okay, this is justice, and this is what one deserves. But the child, and that's something where a lot of the answers and the responses that we often give, especially when it comes down to the plight of children and what they suffer, I don't see a moral improvement or spiritual maturation process for the small child that doesn't yet know the difference between their left and the right hand. And at the same time, what choices have they made such that they deserve sometimes the situations they get in?
That's right.
So those are part of it. It's as sometimes in the scientific or the military realms, they talk about wicked problems. That is what you might say is it's a thorny, tangled up, sometimes unsatisfactory problem that we've got. And at least maybe what the rest of at least my thoughts tend toward is ultimately coming down to what Scott, you alluded to, is we don't have an answer in Scripture ultimately for this. And to me, my response when people bring up the problem of evil is, I don't have a solution to the problem of evil. I can address it, but God has not given us an answer or a solution to the problem of evil as far as I see it. He teaches us and instructs us to have a discipline in how we approach evil and how we deal with it, how we cope with it. But to me, it's kind of like the question of, why did God create people in the first place? I can say there's love involved, there's a desire for unity, there's the outpouring expression of love, but why was that all that necessary? And so to me, the helpful approach that I've, at least at this point in time, taken is, all right, I don't think I can solve the problem of evil, but I can maybe address some of the confusion around it. I can show how it's also a problem for you and a problem for everyone.
Yeah.
And so for that matter, this should not be something that's going to get in my way of my faith in God or not. And so I think it's good to clean up the brush that might obscure clarity on looking at the issue. I think it's good to deal with bad arguments, unsatisfactory responses. And I think definitely the book of Job points the way ultimately in that, God has not condescended to give us all the answers on that. And the way I see it is this: for God to explain the problem of evil to me would be maybe like my trying to explain to my dog the problem of only 2 scoops of food a day and not 3. And that is, if he were to explain it, would I understand it? There's a moral calculus that God is obviously aware of and utilizing. I don't know. And maybe we can get more into how Job addresses this, but that to me is part of, like you said, Scott and Josh, you also brought this up. The end of the book of Job, there's that extended statement that God gives to Job. He decentralizes man, talking about the world, the cosmos that exists. He has that line there where I think it's in chapter 38, but he says, I cause it to rain on a land where there is no man. And so he just really decentralizes humanity in a sense. And he brings up the viciousness of the animal kingdom, lions and hawks that devour prey. There's just a moral calculus that goes on that sometimes seems so harsh and bitter and cold to us. And God is saying, you don't understand, and I'm not going to explain it to you, but there's a moral calculus in this universe that humanity is not even aware of. So I think that kind of humility is something that the end of the book of Job helps, and maybe that's ultimately that response then to the problem of evil is humility and faith.
Before you go to Job, and Scott, that might be where you want to go, but I want to just back up a little bit, because you said something I never heard before, I never considered before, but it was, to me, like, wow, it was a light bulb going off. So the atheist, the skeptic, the non-believer says to me, so give me a reason why there's evil. And we try to come up with all, and they're not satisfied. As you just said, they're not satisfied. So therefore, they'll take the stance, well, therefore, there's no God. Well, wait a minute, let's turn it around. And that's what you're saying. Can you give me an explanation from your non-believing, your atheist point of view? Because it exists, as you guys already met. Can you give me an explanation? They're going to be just as dumbfounded as me. So therefore I say, well, okay, because of what you're saying, I'm going to start accepting that concept or start accepting my concept. There's no reason to reject or accept God based on that argument, is what I'm starting to hear you say. That argument does not address whether God exists or not. Neither side can give an answer. Therefore, let's not even rely on what we think we know the answers when there is no answer. To then let that be the guide to whether there is a God or not a God. Am I making sense on that? I might be going crazy on that one.
No, I like that. I think that's well said and well articulated. And in my experience, the only answer that the atheist or the materialist can give is, well, good and evil are like any number of other experiences we have, and that is, it's just a mirage. Concepts like free will, even consciousness itself, notions of good and evil, these are just useful mirages that human beings have evolved to cope and to survive. And as long as you know it's the useful mirage, then that somehow liberates you to live more freely, to live with a more dignified way. Again, that to me is, I say, okay, I can take that and I can say that is unsatisfying, and you could plug that in to reverse the logical premises of the problem from evil. You could turn around to say, well, therefore, the atheistic or the agnostic worldview, even the materialistic worldview, is illogical. And I think, like you said, I think that's a useful direction to take it. So maybe we can say, all right, let's set this aside for the moment and maybe consider some other topics.
There might be so when that argument comes up, then it might be nice to say, how do you know that? Well, they can't say they know that, but they feel it, they believe it. Oh, you believe that. There's a faith. Scott,
There's also,
you were going, Scott.
yeah. So I think there's a misconception of God here too. And again, I'd come back to, look, if we can both agree evil exists, and then there's your mirage people, your Calvinistic atheism kind of, and say it's mirage or something. But most people will say, yes, evil exists. I'm more interested in the solution for evil than the cause of evil. If a bunch of toxic waste comes down a river and is polluting a town, you could spend time trying to figure out where it came from and everything else, but getting out of it and getting cleaned up is probably more effective than trying to decide why something came down the river in the first place. One perception of God, and I think it's common, is the grandfather God that gives you good stuff.
Hmm.
You know, it's if you need help, he does what you want. He gives you stuff. He gives you presents. When you want something, you ask for him and you get it. If you asked him and you didn't get it, he must not exist. And then there's the referee God that, you know, he should have stopped that from happening. He should have stopped the evil. And to be fair, there are passages that clearly teach that to an extent, the blessings and cursings in Leviticus and such. It's not an individual thing, it's a national thing. If you as a nation are doing this, here's the blessings you'll get. If you as a nation are doing that, here's the curses that you'll get. So boom, boom. But you know what? When they were being blessed, Achan still sinned and got punished. And when they were doing evil, Daniel still found favor with God. But Daniel still suffered. But you know, if you're playing in league or ball or something, you get offended if a foul is not seen. Or if you're watching your favorite team, that guy, that was a foul. They didn't call it. And people get really upset with the refs because you missed one. So we want justice, but Amos 5 teaches us a lesson about this. Amos 5 says in verse 14, seek good and not evil, that you may live, and so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you as you have said. And then it says in verse 18, woe to you that desire the day of the Lord. So let's just kind of get a picture here. People going around saying, oh, God's with us. By the way, I've got a Nazi belt buckle from World War II. And the swastika is in the middle. You know what it says above and below it? God with us.
Really?
God. You know, with uns. It's and so people all the time, oh yeah, God's with us against other people. It's other people's sins that we're upset about. And so here God's telling these people, seek good. You stop seeking evil. You start seeking good. Then God will be with you like you claim he is. Woe to you that desire the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It's going to be bad news for you. It's darkness and not light. It's as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him. And so here's a point I think is significant. The people that say, why didn't a good God stop that? That drunk driver that ran into that mom and crippled her and killed her 2 children. Why didn't the referee step in and stop that from happening right there? But you know what people don't want? They don't want God refereeing them all the time. Because God tells us there's going to be a day of judgment. It talks about in Romans 9, he put up with long suffering, vessels of wrath, fit for destruction. And that God's wanting everybody to repent, but sooner or later, the day of judgment is going to come, and which levels of evil are going to be punished. The drunk driver that crippled the mom and killed the child, he's going to be punished. Who else is going to be punished? The gossip. The guy who's got 2 or 3 baby mamas and he's not there taking care of his kids. The person watching pornography. The person that's proud and arrogant, self-righteous. The person who didn't murder a child, but he's neglecting his own children or just putting them in harm's way. When God punishes evil, his definition of evil is bigger than our definition of evil. Our definition of evil tends to be the people worse than me. I like it. You know, you got the guy with drugs. Yeah, well, I wasn't a dealer. He was a dealer. Yeah, but I didn't deal to kids. He dealt to kids. Drew, you might recognize this type of mentality. You know, well, I only dealt to kids that were already using. They were going to get anyway. I didn't hook them on it. He hooked them on it. Who's at the bottom of the totem pole in the prison that everybody hates?
Me. The individual.
The child molester. You know,
What happens on the other side of the fence? I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
That's the one that everybody looks down on because he's worse than us. They should look down on it. But the person outside of prison says, you're all criminals. And before God, we've all been evildoers. And so when we say, why doesn't God do something about them? I want him to do it right now. If God took out all the evil in the world right now, just kicked them all out of the game, who'd be left?
Nobody.
We have to repent and come to Christ and let the blood wash away the evil that we've done.
Back to what you were saying, Jonathan. But now, actually, both of you were saying it in different ways. We're really not going to know why evil is here. So, the first thing that will come to my mind is, okay, and I like what you said, Scott, then let's deal with what we have with and not be so hung up on why it's here, because no one can really come down and answer that question. So is there more conversation you can have going down that road, Jonathan, about let's just give that up. Let's agree that, we're not going to come with that solution. So what else can we talk about?
What I want to go to with any conversation, as soon as I can get there on the same train with someone, is get back to the resurrection. And what the resurrection does for me is, I think there are two different lines of thought there. And one is, all right, whatever might be the philosophical discussion that we've got here and its problems or the logical jousting that we might do, the resurrection is either a historical fact or it's not. It either happened or it didn't. And if it didn't happen, it doesn't matter. The conversation is just a diversion from the pains of life. But if it did happen, whatever you or I might think about the problem of evil, we've got to deal with a resurrected Christ. And I think that's one direction that I think is helpful to look at from that perspective. But also there's another road you can get into thinking about the resurrection, and that is, I can't explain evil. I don't know why God allowed sin and suffering and all these things that we would call evil generally. But I do know one thing. My God has not made himself immune from the suffering. That he himself chose to enter a world of suffering. It ultimately led to his death by his own, like the ultimate act of evil in this entire universe for all time. God was the one who suffered it.
Yeah.
The greatest injustice, it was him who suffered it. And so we might complain about our lot in life. We may, bemoan what happens to us. But before we charge God with being unfair or unloving to me, he himself uniquely chose to suffer in a way from evil that none of the rest of us can. And that's, maybe where we can start going with, okay, let's talk about the historical documentation for the life of Christ, his death, the resurrection, what that means. And now let's just kind of get at this conversation through another door. I think that to me would be ultimately the path that I would want to go with someone that I'm discussing that with. And like I said, regardless of the philosophical issue at hand, it's ultimately, I think the scriptures also put this as the centerpiece, and that is the eyewitnesses and the prophetic confirmation of the resurrection. That's the answer to me, or at least the addressing the problem of evil.
And that little child that was killed by the drunk driver will be resurrected. And unto little children belong the kingdom of heaven.
And isn't that too, I'll just say real quick, the classical argument often goes, well, if God sees the evil and can and wants to do something about it, he's obviously not. Well, that's how you would run the universe. Who's to say that he's not seeing it and caring about it and going to do something about it? Where you are basically saying, because I wouldn't run the universe that way, I'm either not going to believe in him or he's not worth believing in. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if the God of the Bible, my God, is the one we're discussing, I won't understand him. I won't comprehend his ways. So I'm not in a position to evaluate him.
Yeah.
Good
And there's
point.
so much good God is doing that we kind of dismiss that. And we just want to focus on the things that we think he's doing wrong.
Yes.
We're
There's-
making God in our image, aren't we, when we do that?
Yes, we're deciding what God should do, and that's kind of God's point to Job. He doesn't say to Job, Job, let me go back and explain what happened here. He goes, Job, do you know how this works? Do you know how that works? Were you there then? I'm God, you're not. There's a lot of things you don't know. There is, however, a text in the New Testament I do think is helpful. It will not answer everybody's questions about everything. Does tell us partly why God made things the way he made it. It's in Romans chapter 8, verse 20. And before we look at it, I'd like to just paint a real quick picture real quick. So we read God creates the Garden of Eden. Everything is very, very good. There's Adam, there's Eve, there's all these lovely fruit trees and everything. This is great. Why let a serpent get in there?
Mm.
You know, why not grab that serpent, throw him out into the, lake of fire and brimstone right then? Watch where Satan is in Scripture. He's in the garden. Later, he appears before God in the book of Job. Later, Jesus says, I see him falling like lightning. Revelation 12 describes him crying as the great red dragon to destroy the pregnant woman and the man-child. But he fails. The man-child ascends to the right hand of God, and Satan is cast down. And there's rejoicing in heaven, but it says, watch out, earth. He's angry. And then he gets these bad guys, the earth beast, sea beast, and he's attacking the followers of Christ. And when they're defeated, they're thrown into the lake of fire. The dragon isn't. He's restrained. He's chained up to not be able to do that again for a while. And then it says he's going to be loosed again. And at the end of the book, God takes the dragon and throws him in the lake of fire. Why not just do it at the beginning?
Yeah.
Romans 8:20.
I'm going to say that again so people can hear it. You're going to Romans chapter
Romans
8, verse
20. And this
Okay.
is not going to answer everybody's question. Why did this happen to me? And why did that happen? And how can anything good come out of this situation? But there is a general principle here that's super powerful. You read this verse one time, and it's a little confusing. You break it down, it's super vivid. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. It's hard to grasp all of that in one mouthful. Second phrase of time. Verse 20. Creation was subjected to futility. When did that happen?
at the fall.
Genesis 3. Now there's going to be multiplied pain in childbirth, thorns, thistles, problems. You're going to get sick. You're going to die. It's going to be hard. What does Ecclesiastes say? Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. I think maybe the King James reads that way here in Romans 8:20, if I remember correctly. So creation subjected to vanity. Why? Creation was subjected to vanity. And it says, not willingly. What does that mean?
It didn't want to go there.
Yeah, it's not like Eve goes, ooh, that looks like it would be good for multiplied pain and childbearing. And Adam says, hey, I might die and have thorns and thistles. No, they were tempted by what they were tempted by. They didn't want the consequences that came. So these concepts, creation was subjected to futility, not because we wanted life to be futile. So why? Creation was subjected to vanity, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. Who's that? God. in hope. What hope? That the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. God lets us live behind enemy lines. Now, when somebody says, well, what about the little child? It didn't, the 3-year-old child that died of a, heart defect, or, a mother that beat the child, or a terrible traffic accident, tornado. That child wasn't learning a lesson and didn't need to learn a lesson. So there's things that are not specifically in this text, but the general principle is this: God subjected creation to vanity. We didn't want it. He chose to subject it to vanity in the hope that we would turn from these vain things to something better. And the fact is, when everything goes our way, we are not very humble and don't pay attention to God. And when we realize we are small and not very, very powerful, and we can't handle all the evil and misfortune, suffering that surrounds us, a good heart humbles itself before God. The prodigal son, who wanted all the goodies and none of the responsibilities, ran away and partied. And what's the last thing the text says before it says he came to himself? There's a Jewish boy wishing he had it as good as a pig. It's like, man, those pigs have some good food there. I wish I could have some of that. A Jewish boy wishing he had it as good as a pig is not a good place to be. But that's when he came to himself. But what's the last words in that text before he came to himself? No one.
Say that again.
No one gave him anything.
Oh, interesting.
The next words are, he came to himself. What if grandma had heard he was in trouble and sent him a Discover card?
Oh, he wouldn't come to himself.
Rented him a hotel room for the next year, and gave him, unlimited, buffet tickets or something. Would he have come to himself?
No.
When he hit rock bottom, he came to himself. And so I think it's God's purpose that we do live in a fallen world, and he will judge that fallen world someday. And he's not going to just judge the guys that did something bad to me. I'm also responsible because of the bad that I've done before him and to others. And the line of where he calls the foul is a lot tighter than where I would have wanted to call it. And we've all, like sheep, gone astray. But God laid on Jesus the iniquity of us all, because he doesn't want us to suffer that. And he offers us a way eventually out of the suffering.
That son that left and wanted to eat with the pigs.
That's not where it started out, Walton. That's where he ended up.
No, but he wasn't asking, at least we don't have a record that, now why is this happening to me? He wasn't asking that. So maybe we need to realize, let's not ask why, because we don't have an answer.
And he does know what he did.
He knows where he can go.
I'm going to go back to my father and say, Father, I've sinned, and et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes, sometimes it's somebody, when the prophet is, alive during the famine is there for him too. And Daniel's going to suffer. Shadrach and Meshach are going to suffer. And Shadrach and Meshach don't say, I know that God's going to keep me from burning up in that fire. They don't know if he will or not, but they know he's God, and they know what they're supposed to do. And so we don't always have to know what God's going to do or why God's going to do it, but know what Shadrach and Meshach said. We don't know what's going to happen, but we know what he could do if he chooses to, and we know what he expects out of us.
But I'm really liking, not only do we not know, but we don't know why. Why do I get hung up on needing to know why? I guess that's part of us. Men have that desire to know why things. That's our pride maybe getting in the way.
The Sunday before my
Scott,
Sunday before my son drowned, I did a sermon and I pointed out I said, how many of us know that there are drunk drivers in the world? Everybody knows that. How many people of us know that there's cancer? We all know that. Does that make us think there's not a God? No. But if tomorrow your wife gets killed by a drunk driver or gets cancer, what question are you going to want to ask? Why? We knew before that's part of this life, that it does exist. Whether we understand everything about it or not, we know those things exist. But when it happens to us, then we want to demand why and the reason. And with Job, he's never told all the reasons. But he knows what he needs to do.
Scott, what year was that with your son? I'm sorry?
2013.
That's the same year I lost my wife. And I was going to bring that up where you and I share that pain. Losing the son is harder. But where do you go? I didn't ask why. At that point in my life, my faith was strong enough to know. And I kept going back to where Jonathan started taking us down the road. The resurrection of Jesus Christ.
3 things helped me. I'll say them real quick. 1, my respect for my son. He was a good man. He was a godly man. The river where he drowned, the guys that had been homeless under the bridge told me about how he would bring them food and stuff and help them. He was a good man. That helped. Number 2, in class, the morning of the day that Adam died, this question was asked. Jonathan, it was a college town, and the class teacher said in an aggressive way, these college students, when your professor says, why would a good God let bad things happen to good people? What are you going to say? And Adam raised his hand and he said, I like to tell my friends that this world is like a broken down, decaying house. And my God takes care of his people and gets them out of it.
Amen.
Later that day, when he went for his usual swim in the river, he didn't realize how different the hydraulics were because of the flooding. And he drowned. But I know what he said that day, and that helped me a lot. And the third thing that helped me was this. People prayed for Peter because I'd prayed for my son. I'd prayed for his safety just a day or two before. People prayed for Peter, and he got out of prison. Who didn't get out of prison in Acts 12? One of Jesus' best friends. Did nobody pray for James? I'm sure they did. God doesn't owe it to us to give everything that we ask for. And if we did, every Christian would be thousands of years old. Every time we have a hole, we pray for them. They'd be, that's not life. Peter did get delivered. For how long? Later, the same thing's going to happen to Peter. And those 3 things help me.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Scott. Thank you, Jonathan, for bringing up the topic. We'd like to have you come back and bring us more topics. This is a good discussion we had today. Thank you. Josh, thank you for your input. And I want to just invite everyone to give your comments and what you think about what we're talking about from your point of view as well, and maybe some of the things you went through. Share it with us on BibleQuest.org or on the YouTube channel. And we want to invite everyone back again next week when we will return. Thank you. Have a great day.
Yep. Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan, thank you for being with us, and hope you can be with us again sometime.
Sure thing. I enjoyed it, guys. Next time.
Yep.